lot of what's animating President Trump and his team is a sense that the Chinese have to reach out to us. They're weak, and we have all the cards. I don't think that's accurate.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. And I'm joined in my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, who is the professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, Chag Sameach.
Well, thank you. We had a great Passover. We're about to be inundated by all 10 grandchildren, which will be a joyful thing. I'm doing pretty well, but I've carried the burden of discussing the latest jackassery of the week, for almost a month now, and I think it's your turn. So, do you have something for us?
I have something for you. So, in my former home in the Department of State, where I was a Foreign Service officer for 30 years, we now have a new Director General. And the new Director General is an 04 untenured officer. This is the equivalent of making a Navy Lieutenant Commander, the Chief of Naval Operations. I can't even begin to convey the insanity of it. Moreover, he gave a speech which our colleague Joe Perticone in the Bulwark described as the most MAGA speech ever, in which he not only invoked enormous religious themes inappropriately, but described the President of the United States as the avatar of executive power, whatever that means. Moreover, he has decreed that Foreign Service officers and Department of State employees must inform higher authority if they run into any hint of anti-Christian bias or anti-Christian thoughts, whatever those are. By the way, the recipient of these is his wife, who is now the head of the Civil Rights Department of the Department of State. I spent 20 years of my 30 years in the Foreign Service helping bring down a regime that was based on anonymous denunciations, and now it's resident in my own former bureaucratic home. I couldn't come up with anything, that indicated bigger jackasses at work than that.
Yeah. Well, okay, we know who is undoubtedly responsible for the widespread anti-Christian thoughts in the Department of State, and that is certainly one of our guests, a very old friend of both of ours. Kurt Campbell recently stepped down as Deputy Secretary of State, really someone who's had an amazing career in the think tank world, in the academic world, creating institutions, both a well thought of think tank, the Center for New American Security, major business enterprises, but above all, really a career of terrific public service and very deep thought. And of course, before he was Deputy Secretary of State, he was the lead on the NSC staff in the Biden administration for our Indo-Pacific strategy. One of the people that he brought with him as one of the first people to stand up what I believe is the first China directorate at the NSC is another friend of ours, not as old a friend because he isn't as old. That's Rush Doshi, who has his PhD from Princeton, wrote a wonderful book called The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, which won a number of prizes, and I absolutely commend to all of you. He is currently at the Council on Foreign Relations and at Georgetown. In addition to the pleasure of their company, the immediate trigger for this is we both read an article in Foreign Affairs. It's in, I believe, the current issue, called Underestimating China: Why America Needs a New Strategy of Allied Scale to Offset Beijing's Enduring Advantages. It's a remarkably powerful article, very well argued. There's a lot of data in there. if anybody in the administration reads, it would be worth their making the effort to do so. So first, I just want to welcome you both. It's really a delight to have you both here. I've got a feeling we'll range over a number of issues. I wanted to, if I could, just launch this by what strikes me as a really chilling sentence in the penultimate page of the article, which reads as follows. If the United States fails to pursue scale with others, or retreats to the Western Hemisphere while undoing its alliances, the contest for the next century will be China's to lose. There are a whole bunch of thoughts in there. I'll sort of begin by noting that, you begin by describing the ways in which people have begun to be fairly optimistic about the U.S.-China contest. But could you first welcome, and then secondly, could the two of you unpack what you mean in that sentence, and we'll take it from there.
Maybe I'll start for a few minutes, Eliot, Eric, and then ask Russ to jump in. So I think, as you, rightly point out, Eliot, there were many purposes to this argument and to this article, and there were a number of things that we wanted to accomplish. The first is to basically try to level set on how we think about China's power. And we put that in a larger context of, frankly, calculations or miscalculations that have been prevalent in strategic thinking and hegemonic prophecy for decades about U.S. power, about China, about Japan, just wildly fluctuating. And I think Rush has pointed out most clearly in his writings and also in this piece is that we have now lurched from one extreme in which we thought China was dominant 4 years ago, and that there were, immediate signs of decay in the Western world, and that their dominance economically, they would pass us, and that they would be the most important strategic player on the global stage in less than 15 or 20 years. And then suddenly, 4 years later, and I would say that those 4 years from our perspective probably were undervalued in terms of some of the investments that we made domestically, some of the work that we've done with allies and partners that has suddenly shifted. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing, Eliot and Eric, is in this administration a propensity to view China as weak and down and out, probably down on their luck, and they're going to determine to press advantages. And I think what we try to do at the outset, and I really commend Rush on this, is to go through systematically measurements, determinations of Chinese power, which frankly are inbuilt and they're going to be with us for decades. And then the remainder of the piece really is an argument that, unlike other challenges that the United States has faced, either during the Second World War or during the Cold War, in which we had the advantage of scale, and it was our adversaries or our potential adversaries that were collectively worried about our ability to mobilize rapidly and put the vast capacity of the American people to work on, industrialization, military capacity. And you had lots of debates about that before the Second World War, and frankly, even during elements of the Cold War as well, particularly in the 1980s. And we argue that this is the first challenge that the United States has faced in its history in which it's not possible to meet and match the challenge presented by China alone, and that we needed to do it with allies and partners. We tried, Eliot and Eric, to make this an argument that basically challenges the orthodoxies, both in the Trump administration, but frankly in the Biden administration as well, that this is not an argument for a continuation of business as usual, but frankly to reimagine what these alliances can be, that they are not, historical remnants of post-World War II engagement in either Asia or Europe, but that they have potential across many variables: shipbuilding, defense industrial capacity, joint efforts in technology, both to support efforts and to limit the flow of certain capabilities with China. So the truth is, I think Rush and I believe that this is an important, coherent piece. I do believe, Elliot and Eric, I have to believe that there are still elements in the Republican Party. This entire argument, frankly, originally was Republican in nature. The idea, strong trade, allies and partners, deep investment in military engagements. I don't want to take us off course, but one of the architects of that approach died 2 days ago. And look, I know that I don't want to bring up other issues, but frankly, Rich Armitage did more to support allies and partners than probably anyone else. And he went directly at a conventional wisdom that put China at the center of our world. Rush?
Well, thanks, Kurt. And thank you, Eric and Eliot, for having us on. Excited to chat with you. Let me just say maybe a few things. The basic premise of the piece is that scale matters in the rise and fall of great powers. And as Kurt alluded to, the U.S. has always had scale on its side. It's always been the larger power against most of the other competitors it's faced. And when you don't have scale, as the case of Great Britain shows, if your productivity methods diffuse to others and they become as productive as you, but they're larger, if they can achieve scale on a larger foundation, they can outgun you, basically. The second big point that we wanted to make was that China does have a sense of scale, and we can go through some of the statistics, but when you look at their just manufacturing capability, it's 2 times the United States now. The UN estimates it'll be 4 times the United States in about 5 years. And then you go down metric by metric that matters in the 21st century. Electric vehicles, they're more than 2/3. Batteries, they're more than 2/3. Drones, they're more than 80%. Critical minerals, they're more than 90%. Solar panels, they're more than 90%. And critically, robotics, right? Industrial robotics are the future of manufacturing. And they are installing 7 times more industrial robots every year than the United States, and more than half of the world's industrial robots. That's just a small snapshot, right? Take power generation, they're 2 times the US in power generation. That doesn't mean the US doesn't have enduring advantages. It has a lot. But that brings me to the third point. The US advantages are in common with others, because if you include the US and all its allies and partners, that sense of daunting scale that China seems to have, it flips back in our favor across every single metric. Whether that's GDP, where we completely outclass them, whether that's manufacturing, where we're going to be 60% with our allies of the entire world's manufacturing, we'll outstrip them in patents, active top-sided publications, as well as in key technologies of the future. That's the scale that we were talking about with allies. And the piece is really about interrogating the logic of that scale and how you can create it through going beyond even the Biden administration's approach. And I'd add one last thing. Scale is a destination we hope to reach. There are many paths to get there. And I'm not sure we're saying that there's only one path. There are things the Trump administration could do if it changed course to also build scale. This isn't a sort of everything they do is wrong kind of piece. But we are saying that certain missteps, as you identified, Eliot, in that line, could leave us alone on the world stage. And if that happens, then the world truly is China's to lose.
You talk about in the piece not just the fact that we have allies and we need to have them on our side in the contest with China, but also that we need a kind of new type of alliance management. One of the big takeaways, I think, from the piece is that just the traditional approach to alliance management, it will not be sufficient. You call for something that you term capacity-centric statecraft. Now, I'm very open to that idea because it's very consistent with the findings of the National Defense Strategy Commission that I co-chaired with Jane Harman in terms of trying to find synergies with our allies and doing things in a way that we really haven't done before. And Rush and Kurt, I wonder if you could describe a little bit of what you have in mind.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you. I mean, the capacity-centric statecraft concept is really kind of at the heart of what we're talking about. And what we're saying is that too often our alliances have been shaped by hierarchy. They've been shaped by habit. They've been focused on military issues. But we're saying that alliances are much more than tripwires or protectorates or vassals or status markers. They have to be considered platforms for capacity building. And that has to be true across all domains. So you can start with the military domain, right? In the military domain, we want capacity to flow in both directions. So for us, that could mean allied investment in the weaker parts of our defense industrial base. And we've been talking for years now about potentially Japan and Korea investing in U.S. shipbuilding. Now there's a chance, perhaps as these deals are being worked out by the Trump administration, to make that a reality. But we also have to have capacity flow the other way. That means more sensitive U.S. military technology to allies. And as Kurt has mentioned before, and I'm sure he'll go into greater detail here, it's often difficult to do that because there's a cohort within the State Department that doesn't want capabilities to proliferate for reasons of arms control. And there's a cohort within the Defense Department that doesn't want capabilities to proliferate for purposes of maintaining American military advantage. And, that makes sense, from a certain point of view. But capacity-centric statecraft is really about pooling capacity. We have to break down some of those barriers. We also have to consider things like novel joint formations. It would be interesting to think about in the Indo-Pacific context, anti-ship cruise missile battalions, for ground-launched cruise missiles between the U.S. and key allies so that we can train up our allies on some of the critical innovations the Marine Corps has adopted. For example, the Marine Littoral Regiment kind of structure. So this is an example of capacity emerging from new joint training and actual formations, interoperability. And there's also, a lot of stuff that has to happen on the economic side. Right now, everybody is talking about tariffs to protect American manufacturing. But what good is that if your companies still get outplayed in third country markets? You need an actual shared market between your allies and partners. And if you go back to the Cold War, of course, we had a kind of free world trading system. It was just called GATT. And we don't have that now because China is in the WTO. But what we could do is erect a common tariff or regulatory wall against some of the Chinese excess capacity that is deindustrializing our countries. And we could also align on investment rules or export controls and research protections, both to protect what we have actually developed individually and in common, but also to create mechanisms to make sure we can invest in each other's countries. And I guess I'd end with saying, we've talked for a long time about an economic Article 5, where we pool our economic capability together. If somebody tries to coerce one of us, then we can respond in common. These are the kinds of ways in which capacity can be pooled together across alliances. And we do think it's a different model, right? This isn't just about security cooperation. It's really thinking about the material foundations of American hegemony and power, which are economic and technological too, and finding a way to build connectivity with our allies in those domains.
Let me just follow up for 1 second. And Eliot, I want to kick it back to you, which is, and Kurt might want to comment on this. I mean, you guys pioneered some of this, obviously, with the AUKUS arrangement. There have been other defense industrial cooperation arrangements with Japan for standard missile building. So you have some experience with exactly how hard this is. And I have some scar tissue as a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy because, you in the government, and Kurt knows this very well, you've got people in your institution who want to do the export thing, and then you've got people who want to control the technology, don't want to do the export thing, even with close allies, and then senior officials, whether it's the deputy secretary, the undersecretary, end up having to adjudicate all these things. There's not enough time in the day because the number of transactions is so great that you can actually do this. So, Kurt, if you want to comment on sort of how hard it is to break down these barriers that Rush was just talking about, I'd love to hear it.
Sure, thank you. And we talked a little bit about this already, but Eric, I will say this: we were struck. There are learning moments constantly when you're confronted with crises. The most, I think, pressing one from my perspective was our shortfall in critical munitions that was laid bare during the early periods of the war in Ukraine, and the desperate search for extra ammunition, whether it be just artillery rounds, but long-range strike capabilities like Tomahawk and the like. We as you said, Eric, we began a process largely with our closest allies and partners about how to seek co-production. It would be hard to describe how difficult some of those negotiations are. And they are, I would love to tell you that they are simply between two agencies in the U.S. government. They are not. They also involve companies who have their own interests and, frankly, are less concerned that U.S. stockpiles of critical munitions are low. And so it was extremely challenging. And I will say, probably it's fair to say that the two officials that were at the time most involved in the early stages of AUKUS were Russia and I, frankly. And so we saw all the challenges that, the inhibitions on sharing sensitive technology with even our closest allies. I've never maneuvered harder. I've never tried to be more persuasive about the arguments. And I'm very proud of how AUKUS turned out. But I will tell you that, in the immediate moments, I can recall immediately after it was launched, we had a wonderful session, caught everyone a little bit off guard. They couldn't believe that we had conducted over 6 months intense negotiations with two allies involving hundreds of people in technology and nuclear capabilities, submarine design. And we launched it. And I remember Rush and I were actually sitting outside the Oval Office with President Biden. And it was kind of a wonderful, exciting moment that we had overcome some obstacles in parts of our government, and we'd gotten the national security advisor and the president to decide to proceed ahead, only to find the following day President Macron coming out and saying, what a dastardly thing this was. We frankly just did not have enough consultation between Australia and France. It is what it is. But when something like that happens, and when President Macron drives the knife in deep and says, this is what I would expect from President Trump and not you, White Houses are very good at figuring out who to blame in situations like this. And so for about 3 months, the only person that would sit at my picnic table for lunch was Rush. And we would just eat our little sandwiches like high school, like we were in the chess club together. Thank God we got through that period, and now we're on the other side. But Eric, every day is about creating new avenues of cooperation, either involving, congressional engagement, overcoming obstacles. I will tell you, when in doubt, recognize that in everything that we try to do in these joint efforts, there's opposition, and you can never relent. You've got to be on top of it constantly. My hope is that the Trump administration will continue some of these things, carry on with the Quad and the like, but it's hard to know. And I think one of the reasons why we wrote this article, and you listen carefully to what Rush says, it's not too late. And frankly, there are people in the administration that understand an America alone is an America that is in a weakened position. And so there is the chance to sort of remaneuver around the concept of working more closely with allies and partners. But at the same time, I will tell you, quite honestly, there are just as many people in government that are wary of allies and partners in a way that I have not seen since the 1930s.
So, Kurt, just listening to you describe that, the two of you eating alone at the picnic table, I seem to remember you once saying to me, bureaucratic politics, it's a continual struggle. And then sometimes it's the Donner Party.
Yeah, that's right.
Which, that's a metaphor that really stuck with me, I have to say.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
So many questions. I want to, in a way, take you back for a moment to the diagnosis, which is really interesting, because you do tackle the argument that China's in relative decline and that they're in bad shape. And so, you don't smooth that over at all. And we should just kind of recap some of that. And then if the two of you would talk about how you address it, there are tremendous demographic difficulty as a result of the one-child policy and all the rest. They're getting crushed by some of their own financial problems, vast amounts of debt on the part particularly of local governments, vast amounts of overproduction. Maybe this one is, we can't claim as much of an advantage as we'd like, but, an old leader who only hears what he wants to hear, has been in power for a long time, has lots of internal enemies, some of whom may be getting a little bit more vocal, still deep-seated corruption. I mean, he seems to feel the need to purge the military. Again, we may not be quite as far from that as I would wish. But then you lay all that out, and then you say, but it doesn't matter as much as you think it matters. And I wonder if you could just spell that out for our listeners?
Sure, I can start us off. I mean, I think it's possible for two things to be true at the same time. It's possible that China can have significant macroeconomic challenges and also become more strategically formidable and more technologically formidable in the time frame that matters most for great power competition. That's the key question. So too often we just say, hey, look at their macro problems. Clearly that means strategic disadvantage, but it's never so neat. And poured concrete is still poured concrete. So when you look at the facts, even some of China's weaknesses are best thought of, with some degree of nuance. Take GDP. Everyone has talked about how China's economy is smaller than the US economy, maybe even shrinking relative to the US economy in some terms, but those are dollar terms, right? A lot of that turns on the strength of the US dollar, which is great for a lot of things. But for generating strategic capacity, adjusting for local prices with purchasing power might matter more. You want to price things in how they cost in China. And there, China's GDP is already 30% larger than ours. It's about 30 trillion to our 24, and it surpassed ours 10 years ago. But put all that aside, if you just look at productive capacity, not value add, it's 3 times the US in productive capacity. So on the GDP metrics, I mean, I'm not sure that's capturing the strategic dimension of the conflict. It might capture quality of life better if you look at nominal terms, but it won't capture power generation. And then you turn to other considerations, demographics. They've got a huge demographic problem. We shouldn't undersell it at all. I mean, in 75 years, their population will fall by half. 1 in every 2 people in China will essentially be gone. So that's a significant problem. But when does that problem become significant for strategy? It's not today. It's not in 5 years. It's in 20, 25 years. And we know that because just like poured concrete, people born are already here. And it turns out that there's a baby boom generation in China that had grandkids. And those grandkids mean that from 2010 to 2020, the population below the age of 14 actually increased in absolute terms and as a percentage of the whole population. Now, that doesn't offset the fact that their population's median age is still going up, but it does buy them some space. Then you add to the fact that, you look at dependency ratios, how many people rely on a worker, right? Elderly folks and kids. And China's dependency ratio won't even be what Japan's is today for another 25 years. So that suggests, again, there's a bit more time on the clock for them. And I'll add a final point here on demographics. China's probably the leader in embodied artificial intelligence and certainly in industrial robotics. And if you go to Chinese factories, right, these famous BYD plants making electric cars, they're not outcompeting because they've got cheap labor or abundant labor. They're outcompeting on the better adaptation of capital equipment for manufacturing. That's a game changer, and we have to take that very seriously. And I guess finally, Eliot, you mentioned debt, and I've been studying the debt problem with people who know it way better than I do for a long time. And it's true, Chinese local governments rely intensely on selling land to finance their own government. But put that aside for a second. Let's look at essentially the central government's debt, the local government's debt, all government debt. Combine that with corporate debt and household debt. That composite number is 300% of GDP in China. That's the debt. If you take that same 3 categories, again, government, corporate, and household, the US is also 300. Japan is 400. The UK is 300. India might be 200. We have to consider the debt question, I think, a little bit differently in a relative basis. And finally, you look at the question of, American companies. We often hear, look, our companies dominate in market cap, right? We've got the biggest companies in the world. And also our companies have a higher share of profits in each of their industries. We dominate technology profits worldwide. We're like half of all technology profits. We're just US companies. But American companies are optimizing for profit, right? They're optimizing for things like that. In China, those companies don't care about profit as much. They're optimizing for market share. They're trying to put their competitors out of business. They're playing the long game. And so their hope is that if they can stay in long enough and they can outcompete us on price, eventually it will fall. And that has worked in industry after industry. You put that whole picture together, and it does tell you that essentially maybe China is more resilient than we think in geopolitics. And I'll end with this one last point that Kurt mentioned at the outset. I remember Kurt and I talking a lot about this 5 years ago. We were writing articles in Foreign Affairs during the pandemic. What does the power balance look like, right? And at that time, there was a sense that the U.S. was in hurtling decline. A lot of people were saying that the U.S. couldn't handle COVID. Jan 6th had tested our democracy. We were walking away from our allies. Our economy wasn't, picking up. And then just 2 years later, I recall seeing everything change, right? By 2022, the narrative had flipped. People were saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows autocracies just can't get it together on military conquest. And that was a moment where Russia-Ukraine looked different. people were saying, look, China's gotten rid of zero COVID, but they're still stagnant and their demographics are getting worse. And their stagnation suggests they're not going to be able to keep up with us. And then people pointed to ChatGPT in December of that year, and they said, look, America pulled another rabbit out of its hat. It always out innovates. And a lot of truth was in those assessments. But the fact that the American assessment of China swung so wildly in just 2 years is a thing that damages our ability to wield consistent strategy. So what we wanted to do was essentially right-size the picture a bit, take it seriously, but then go into some nuance about just how formidable China is. And I do worry that if we don't take that picture seriously, then we don't take our allies seriously, and we make choices that we can't walk away from.
Let me just add one piece to that, and I really associate myself with what Rush just said. What we also argue in this piece, Eliot and Eric, is that it is not just enough to populate and reimagine existing allies and partnerships. We must add to them. And I would simply say we try to argue that there are a few nations, and I remember, Eliot, when I was first getting to know you, we did some work on what was described back in the day as regional hegemons, those countries that were powerful in their local regional context, and what should the American attitude towards those countries be. And so I would simply argue that from my perspective, the most important bilateral relationship that the United States must get right over the course of the next 10 to 15 years is actually the relationship with India. Very complicated democracy, but one that, frankly, I would argue is trending more and more towards working closely with the West and the United States. Towards that end, what we are suggesting, it is not simply the case that you try to align areas strategically, more work and intelligence and military co-production and the like, but that increasingly with key important states, we need to understand what they view to be their dominant, important red lines in foreign policy and national security. So I often found over the course of the last couple of years that the irritants in our relationship with India were often on issues that were absolutely central to India's purpose and position in the world, and we're not even secondary. We're far beneath that on the part of the United States. And
Can you give an example of that, Kurt?
Well, I will. I'll give you one example, but a key example might be Bangladesh, but it is also the case. I think there are still some, and Eric can describe this as well. We lived it in the State Department. There are a group of people that believe that there has to be a kind of balance between our engagement of India and Pakistan. That is so 1990s, and we need to transcend that and recognize that we put our chips on the table with India and understand that partnership is so significant to future manufacturing, technology, and the fact that India rests on the western border of China is a constant reminder to China that it cannot contemplate adventurism willy-nilly, because it has to constantly remember that it has huge strategic challenges in the West. And so these are things that I don't think Americans totally appreciate. But the work that's been done, I think, Eliot and Eric, in a bipartisan manner to build a relationship with India, even under a leader that many find complicated in Prime Minister Modi, I find to be, I think his engagement on the part of India has been powerful and enduring and incredibly valuable to the partnership between the United States and India. And I'd like to see that continue and grow. But that, too, will take some reimagining, some courage, and some determination going forward.
Yeah, I remember being told that I couldn't possibly take a trip to India as Undersecretary of Defense Policy if I didn't also on the same trip, go to Islamabad. So I hear you. Although the fact that in the wake of the Abbottabad raid and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, that kind of thinking persists is actually really perplexing.
But I think one of the hard things, Eric, and this is just something that you could also understand, is that the tragedy of the seams that exist among the combatant commanders and the various regional bureaus leaves these lines that run through South Asia. And so, for instance, we were persistent, and we finally began our first ever set of Indian Ocean dialogues between the United States and India. You think, what an obvious thing to do, but for a variety of reasons, including Indian sensitivities, we had been unable to do so. Now that has been that block has been removed. We are beginning to talk more about our shared goals, submarine issues, the Chinese fleets and activities in Myanmar, port access in places like Sri Lanka. Those dialogues are incredibly important. But what impeded them, what made it more difficult, is the fact that the theater is shared essentially by three combatant commanders, one in Africa, one in CENTCOM, and Pacific Command. And the challenging thing for a combatant command like CENTCOM is to realize that we are in a different world. And the truth is, the dominant command in these discussions really are Pacific Command, and that's just a factor. I remember, Eliot knows this, I joked with him about this once. There was a period over the course of the last couple of years that you could not throw a stone and hit someone that was meeting to discuss the role of the Army in the Indo-Pacific. So the two big sort of cottage industries, how to think about peace in Ukraine and the role of the Army in the Indo-Pacific. And I remember I was invited to one of these many years ago. I've only been invited to one. And I remember I was sitting and Army officers, others ready to take notes. And I said, look, the most important mission, it's critical, it's vital that the Army needs to undertake in the Indo-Pacific is to get much smaller quickly. And they did not like that.
Can't imagine why, Kurt.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? In some ways, it's the obvious one. How likely did the two of you think an open clash between China and the United States is over the next 5 to 10 years? And if you could kind of divide that in a way into two. First, how likely do you think it is that they will do something, different by a quantum than what they've already done vis-a-vis Taiwan in ways which might bring us in, but also the possibilities of a conflict that isn't simply about Taiwan. I mean, I'll just say for my own part, I've always thought, when people talk about war over Taiwan, in the same way that World War II in the Pacific was not war over Pearl Harbor, it was a much broader conflict between two countries. That's the sort of thing that you have to think about. And I'd really be curious to hear what your assessments are of the possibilities and the probabilities.
I want to hear Rush on this, but I'll just add one thing if I can. So I will take your question literally over the next 5 years. And Eliot, I would give you a slightly different answer. I do not believe that we are likely to see an adventurous, purposeful Chinese determination to go out and seize territory and throw the dice. I think in that next 5-year time frame, I do not believe that is the highest probability. However, I think the chances of the United States and China inadvertently finding ourselves in a crisis through miscalculation, through mistake, through not understanding the rules of engagement, a little bit like what you experienced, Eliot, in 2001 with the EP3 crisis. But remember what's happened since then. There was a moment where these crises were unlinked to a larger escalatory framework. And so we were always worried about inadvertence or miscalculation in Europe because things were trigger timed. They would rapidly escalate. And people were always comforted, well, if there was a ship bumping or something here in the Indo-Pacific, lots of brakes on inevitable escalation. That period is now over, Eliot, and the risks of a rapid, uncontrolled escalation, which then causes both countries to respond and counter respond. I think there's a very real risk of that going forward. But I want to hear Rush on this. Rush.
Well, Kurt, I think I'm probably in the same place. My general view is that China's ambitions in the Taiwan Strait are kind of unique relative to its ambitions elsewhere. China feels, I think, in the rest of Asia that it can sort of win without fighting, that there's a way that it can gain sort of regional hegemony short of the direct use of force, simply because of those manufacturing statistics we talked about earlier. People know just the sheer scale that China has. They also know about the ability it has to reach into elite networks in other countries and pay the right people, and the ways in which it can also leverage its economic heft to direct countries to comply with its own preferences. And that's the real playbook that they've run in most of Asia. But the exceptions are with the great powers in Asia, Japan and India principally among them, as well as, of course, separately, the Taiwan question. In the Taiwan Strait, right now, we're seeing the PRC essentially undertake exercises that are deliberately intended to look like preparations for war. So the Chinese are very overt about this. They're very clear. They're explicit in how they describe their own activity. They say, our goal is to make it difficult for you to know whether we're exercising or we're acting. You shouldn't be able to discriminate between the two. That's a very dangerous proposition, especially because it creates the risk that at some point that exercise, combined with other factors they may be undertaking simultaneously, take cyber activity as a good example, could lead the U.S. to see things very differently, move more into the theater, and then there could be inadvertent escalation due to collision or something like that. So that path is very real to essentially a disaster. And Kurt mentioned the EP3 incident. Well, I mean, we know for a fact that over the last several years, China has been taking far more risk in its close intercepts of American aircraft and vessels. I mean, this is an issue that Kurt and I worked on very directly for years without real progress until 2023, when President Biden and President Xi met in Woodside, California. By the way, the foreign ministry was often not fully aware of what was happening in the air and seas, right? The PLA was doing its thing. They felt no compunction to report their military activity to other civilian leaders in the government. And that's also not that different sometimes from what happens in our own system.
I was hoping Rush would mention there were times, Eliot and Eric, where we would be like other parts of our government would report on certain communication activities, and we'd be like, I'm not sure that we really understood that
going on
was ongoing. But can I say one last thing just on that? When we talk about inadvertence or miscalculation, there are more than two actors here. It's not just the United States and China. We're seeing increasingly Chinese activities around Japan, around the Senkaku Islands, but probably most worrisome around Taiwan. So remember, before the decision of, like, the Chinese will use any excuses to move forward to essentially erase or seek to erase common operational practices that were inbuilt for decades. The line that was basically erected artificially, the so-called Baker Line in the 1950s, was respected by both Taiwan and the PRC, again, for a very long period of time. That has been completely obliterated. But now, increasingly, Chinese fighters and ships will venture occasionally into the 20-mile zone that Taiwan has decreed. And the rules of engagement, frankly, in many circumstances call for Taiwan to respond. And so you could easily see an inadvertent act which would then spiral out of control and potentially invoke and engage the United States. I think one of the challenges, though, and, Eliot, one of the things that I was so pleased by, like, you've been working so much more on Asia, your engagement on Taiwan. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a small group of people that really thought that it was important to sustain a democratic, non-official partnership with Taiwan. That group has grown considerably, and they are now dominant in both political parties. when Rush says that there are still things that are, we're not sure and you want to try to influence, I would say there are probably some in the Trump administration that are beginning to think like, this is an awfully challenging task, and Taiwan's only a couple of miles from China. What are we doing here? And you occasionally see comments to that effect. We think one of the most important things to underscore is not only our allies and partners basically in the Indo-Pacific, but to recognize what has been accomplished in Taiwan is a remarkable thing. Its democracy is entrenched. It is resilient in a way, frankly, I would aspire to. And they have stood up quite effectively to challenges that many other lesser nations or places would fold from. I am determined to try to make sure that the national dialogue recognizes the importance of this, but I think probably worthy of a further discussion from both of you, bringing in folks that think about this. I think of all the areas that I think that there's uncertainty about, I think we're starting to see elements in Ukraine. I know I've listened to your earlier pieces. I share some of the concerns there. And clearly, our strategy by giving everything to Russia at the outset in the negotiations doesn't appear to have worked. But likewise, the idea that somehow Taiwan is under consideration, that is not in our strategic interests. I don't know, Rush, do you agree?
I just would add one thing. There's a certain kind of mindset that's emerging currently in the administration, but even in the Democratic Party too, which is essentially maybe you could lose Taiwan, but Asia would still not fall under Chinese hegemony, which is a totally insane argument, in my opinion. It has no bearing with reality. If Taiwan were to essentially, it matters how it happens. I guess there's some truth to that point, but let's put that aside for a second because it's hard to parse in the time we have. But if that were to happen, Japan, Korea, I mean, these countries cannot then count on the U.S. to have their back across the table of issues they have with China, across that gamut. So they're going to basically bandwagon with Beijing. And I think there's a tendency not to understand that countries can bandwagon. And historically within Asia, because of China's sheer gravitational size, because of its scale, as we've been talking about, this goes back to scale, there's been this desire by countries around it not to be in a tense relationship with China, but to accommodate themselves to Chinese power. That is going to happen if Taiwan is mishandled. So when the decision is to be made by many in the Trump administration, should we invest in this mission of deterrence? The answer should be yes, because the stakes are much higher if you don't. And by the way, on the deterrence side, I still have quite a bit of confidence that the PRC doesn't have great confidence in its own ability to take Taiwan. And for good reason. Not only is it a hard mission, but we just saw in the last week or two reports that maybe the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, one of the two, He Weidong, was purged, which I think is wild because, you can do purges one of two ways, right? You can purge people and you can do it for the sake of operational readiness, get rid of the dead weight, FDR style, get better people in charge. I'm not an expert on Civ Mil the way you two are, but just putting it out there. Another way is the Stalin way, get rid of all the experts and then expose yourself to Nazi invasion and face disaster. I thought the Chinese might have been doing it the more competent way first, so I was a bit contrarian there. I'm not so sure if it's true that He Weidong is biting the dust. This is a capable Eastern Theater commander with operational experience who knows how to handle himself in the Taiwan Strait. It's not the guy you would think you would purge. I mean, as an American, I'm happy if he's no longer in direct control of China's military operationally, but it is a strong indicator that maybe they're just not ready yet. And I'll give you one last data point. The Chinese reacted very strongly. Kurt, you were deputy during all of this. I had just left government when they were getting really upset about it. But we had deployed the Typhoon missile system in the Philippines, and they were just not having it, right? And I guess it shows that there are certain capabilities, ground launch missile capabilities, for example, which are hard for them to deal with, that really do concern them. And if you see Japan investing more in those capabilities, us operating more in the Southwest Islands, us doing more in the Philippines, us doing more with Australia for standoff, really emphasizing the Marine Littoral Regiment formation that General Berger sort of innovated. If we start focusing on those kinds of asymmetric capabilities, and we really go hard at it for 2 years, we will have a strong deterrent position in the Taiwan Strait. And so I do feel like there's a bit of defeatism. Our piece talked about Chinese scale, but that was largely in the context, especially of economics, technology, and yes, the generation of military power, but the asymmetry that exists in amphibious operations favors us. And so we should think hard about that before we indulge in fatalism on the Taiwan question.
I agree with what everything that Rush and you and Kurt just said. And I do worry that in the Republican Party, there is a certain amount of defeatism about Taiwan. I've heard it from very senior Republican senators in private. China's big, Taiwan is small, it's close there, we're far away, how can we really stop this, if it gets going? So I think your cautionaries and your attempt to maintain some balance between defeatism and triumphalism is very much, needed right this moment. I guess I would ask you one other thing. My observation, from the work that Jane Harman and I did with the National Defense Strategy Commission, was that folks in the Pentagon were very focused on the cross-strait scenario, in almost to a fault, I think, because I can imagine, for all the reasons you said, Rush, that if you're sitting in Beijing, launching this is actually a pretty big endeavor, and a lot could go wrong. And it's, one of the hardest things to do militarily, a amphibious invasion across 90 miles of open ocean. A blockade, however, that you throw around the island, and if you look at the activity that Kurt was describing, not just the air activity, but a lot of what you've seen at sea in the wake of Speaker Pelosi's visit and Speaker McCarthy's visit, looks like what a envelopment, what a blockade would look like if you were actually going to implement it. And given their observations of our behavior in Ukraine and our extraordinary sensitivity to the risks of nuclear escalation, manipulated, I think, by President Putin quite skillfully, as they approach sometime in the 2030s, and I would say my view is probably going to happen earlier than we think, they emerge as a nuclear peer. If you're in Beijing, why wouldn't you throw a blockade around the island and then dare the United States to break it with the risk of nuclear escalation that you hang over everybody's head? And that seems to me to be a more realistic fear right now than an actual cross-channel invasion. Yet when you ask colleagues in DoD what are you going to do about that, you get blank stares and kind of deer in the headlights. I'd just be curious, the two of you, to comment on that.
So, look, I would just say just a couple of things to that, if I can. I think Eric, the one thing I would say is I'm grateful that there are increasing pockets of folks that are more focused on the challenges that we're facing in the Indo-Pacific. But I think, and frankly, chief among them, the best group going, the work done by Net Assessment was without peer. And it was Rush who insisted that Jim Baker come in, brief the senior team at the White House on numerous occasions. Now, a lot of those guys don't like those briefings because they're hard to hear, but they are essential. But I would say the larger picture is one that is a confounding one, Eric, which is that despite there is some more focus on the Indo-Pacific, not nearly enough. There, for a variety of reasons of preoccupation, focus elsewhere, domestic politics, even as we speak now, today, as we're talking about the importance of the Indo-Pacific, if we had Admiral Paparo here, and he was talking to us honestly, he would complain how many of what he would call his assets are deployed and waiting for potential conflict in the Middle East. And so I think the larger argument here that Rush and I have tried to make consistently is that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is going to be written here. We as a nation have always given short shrift to the Indo-Pacific. That continues. It's going to be hard, and we've got to muster more capacity, more institutional commitment, and more focus over a substantial period of time. And that is like with huge numbers of people vacating the U.S. government, a lot of expertise leaving, that is a concern. I'm just not going to sugarcoat it. You've seen the reports today about parts of the State Department that are going to be basically asked to leave, and some of that, it's not all distant councils offices. It's also capacity in the Indo-Pacific as well. So this is a real challenge that we're facing, and I just want to underscore how significant it is. I will also say we focus often on the steps that the Chinese take to signal their preparation, their focus on the possibility of a blockade. But the truth is that there are also steps that we take that are not as well understood and are understood by the Chinese, but maybe we don't talk about as much. Let me give you an example, Eric. So not long after the Chinese deployed in 5 quadrants for a period of time to basically signal their capability and their readiness to be able to take actions, in that immediate time frame, simultaneously 5 American submarines surfaced in an area very near where these, undetected initially until they went and then went under and then left, to signal that yes, we have capabilities as well that would make this difficult. Now, ultimately, this is going to require vigilance, constant vigilance, determination. And I will also say, like, one of the things that I think Rush and I both learned is that the reason why the period right now is so dangerous is that there are absolutely no lines of communication. And I think I'm convinced that at a period where you're involved in deep competition, a degree of deep diplomacy is required. Now, that's an awfully hard argument to make to some, but Eric and Eliot, it is absolutely essential. And right now, neither side can bring themselves to figure out how to at least sit down and have a conversation about the strategic directions ahead. And I'm afraid a lot of what's animating President Trump and his team is a sense that the Chinese have to reach out to us. They're weak, and we have all the cards. I don't think that's accurate.
So I just want to make one final comment, since I know we're running short on time, and you can respond if you want. But I think, in addition to the particular argument you're making about China, you are making an argument for a completely different style of American statecraft than the ones that the 3 older members of this quad here grew up with, which was very much, I think, the kind of legacy approach to alliances that you outlined at the very beginning, Rush. And that's going to be necessary, not just in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to be necessary in Europe and other places as well. That it requires a degree of, if I can put it this way, strategic humility that I don't think has been our strong suit. So I think the article's a good challenge in that way, but these are very, very heavy issues. I can't say I'm coming away from the conversation more reassured, although I do think I understand it a bit better.
Well, these issues are not going to go away. And unfortunately, we do have to let both Kurt and Rush go. But I've learned a lot, actually, from this conversation. And I hope we can have the two of you back from time to time precisely because these issues are not going away. But I do want to thank you for joining Eliot and me on Shield of the Republic today. I think it's been very illuminating for all of us and certainly for our listeners and viewers. So Kurt, to you, and Rush, to you, thank you very much, both for your service in government, recently completed, but for what you continue to do to keep these issues before people.
Amen.
Thank you, Rush.
Thank you for the time. We appreciate it. Great.
We really appreciate it. And we love Shield of the Republic. And I will say that every week must read the Eliot's contributions in the Atlantic as well. So grateful. I'm always grateful to get something free. It's one of the only things that I get. I'm reminded this is a gift from the author. Thank you very much. I acknowledge it on air.
Shameless self-promotion.